Walk into any Walmart in America, and there is one wall almost nobody stops at. Not the rods, not the reels with the shiny handles, the line wall. Little boxes and spools stacked 3 deep, $4, $8, $12, no famous name shouting for your attention, so your eyes slide right past it on the way to something that looks more like a real purchase. That slide is exactly what the tackle industry is counting on, because sitting on that wall, right now, are spools that do the same work as the $25 and $30 line at the premium counter. Same fiber, same fish in the net, and a couple of them are quietly better than the expensive stuff, for reasons that have nothing to do with the price tag. I have watched anglers walk that wall for years and reach for the box with the biggest logo every single time. So today I am going to read that wall the way somebody who actually fishes reads it. 10 spools everyone ignores, ranked, one for every job you fish. And the number one pick is a spool most guys have literally never picked up, that fills every reel you own for less than the price of one fancy spool. This is not a brand-bashing video. The premium line does earn a sliver of that price. Tighter coatings, more consistent diameter, color that holds a little longer. If you are a tournament angler counting every cast, that edge is real, and you should buy it. But for the rest of us throwing on a weekend, a sliver is not a canyon. And there is a reason the industry would rather you never learn to see the difference. You cannot patent the way a person spools a reel. You cannot put cost per yard in a blister pack and sell it back to you every spring. The most valuable things on that wall are the things nobody can put a barcode on, so nobody bothers to tell you. One quick thing before the countdown, because it changes how you see everything after it. Most people will tell you there are 3 kinds of fishing line: braid, mono, and fluorocarbon. That is how the whole wall is organized. It is also not quite true, and the missing 4th kind is one of the best-kept secrets on that shelf. I will get to it at number 3, and once you see it, you will wonder why nobody ever handed it to you. Now here is the part that actually matters. Line is the one piece of gear you never stop buying. A rod you buy once and fish for 10 years. A reel, same story. But line you strip, you cut, you feed to a snag, you respool every season. You buy it again and again for the rest of your fishing life. So every extra dollar of markup is not a one-time hit. It is a small tax you pay forever, which flips the whole game. The Goldmine is not the strongest spool, and it is not the prettiest spool. It is the spool with the lowest cost per yard that is matched to the right job and spooled on correctly. Get those 3 things right, and half the price of that wall disappears in front of your eyes. So as we count down, I am not just naming line. Every one of these is tied to a job, and most of them come with a trick the box will never print, because the trick is free, and free does not sell. Let us read the wall. Number 10. The tough one nobody separates from its twin. Berkley FireLine XT. Right next to it on the peg is FireLine XL, and most people grab whichever one their hand lands on, because the 2 boxes look almost identical. They are not the same line. XL, the L is for limp, is the smooth, low-memory mono built to cast easy. XT, the T is for tough, is built to take abrasion. Same family, opposite jobs. Here is how you use that. If you are throwing around rock, riprap, dock pilings, submerged timber, anywhere your line drags across something that wants to cut it, you want XT. That extra toughness is the difference between landing the fish that wraps you around a piling and telling the story about the one that broke you off. If you are throwing open water and you want the smoothest cast, you want XL. Picking the right twin costs the exact same money and lands more fish. And it is the kind of thing the industry has no reason to explain to you, because both spools ring up the same at the register either way. Number 9. The 60-year-old spool everybody's grandfather fished, that most guys now walk past like it is a museum piece. Stren Original, around $8. It is the line half the folks at the boat ramp learned to fish on, and it is still hanging there for a reason almost nobody says out loud. It's stretch. Modern marketing trained all of us to think stretch is a flaw. Zero stretch. More sensitivity. Feel every tick. That is the whole pitch on the expensive stuff. And for some fishing, that is right. But stretch is not a defect. Stretch is a shock absorber. Picture a base exploding on a crankbait right at the boat. or a big catfish surging the second it sees the net. With a stiff, no-stretch line, that sudden load slams the hook and the knot all at once, and something gives. Usually the hook pulls free or the line pops. Stren's built-in give soaks that surge up like the suspension on a truck rolling over a pothole. That is exactly why so many crankbait and treble hook anglers still reach for a stretchy mono. It is not old-fashioned. It is the right tool for a specific job, sitting on the bottom shelf, ignored, because stretch is a hard thing to sell when the whole industry is busy selling you the opposite. Number 8. The most fished mono in the history of the sport, and the spool I am going to use to hand you the single most valuable free trick in this entire video, Berkley FireLine XL. Around $8, and on the bulk spool you are looking at thousands of yards for the price of one little premium respool. But forget the price for a second, because here is the thing that actually costs you fish. How you put the line on. 9 times out of 10, when somebody's line is jumping off the reel in coils and knotting up on the cast, the line is not bad. It was spooled on wrong, and it is fighting you with twist baked into every single yard. So here is the fix, and it costs nothing. Lay the filler spool flat on the floor, label facing up. Run the line up through the guides, tie it to the reel with the bail open, and start cranking slow with light tension pinched between 2 fingers. Now stop after about 20 turns, and drop some slack. If the line falls in big, lazy loops, you are perfect. Keep going. If it twists up into tight little corkscrews on its own, your spool is facing the wrong way. Flip it over, label down, and keep reeling. That is the whole trick. The pro Mike Iaconelli teaches the same idea a slightly different way. He says, forget the label. Just watch which direction the line peels off the spool, and set it so the line comes off the opposite way the bail turns. Either method gets you the same result. Line that lays on with its natural memory instead of fighting against it. Do this once and you will fix more casting headaches than any $20 upgrade ever will. And notice, there is nothing to sell you here, just a direction to face a spool. That is exactly why you had to find it in a fishing video instead of printed on the box. Number 7. The invisible one that is not actually invisible. Berkley Vanish Fluorocarbon, around $9 a spool. Now, the story you have been told, the story a lot of videos will repeat, is that fluorocarbon bends light almost exactly like water, so the fish simply never sees it. That is the pitch. Let me give you the real number, because the real number is more useful than the myth. How visible a line is underwater comes down to something called refractive index. Basically, how much a material bends light as it passes through. Water sits at 1.33. Fluorocarbon sits at about 1.42. Regular nylon mono sits up around 1.53 to 1.62, so fluoro's number is closer to water than mono's is. That part is true, and it is the real reason fluoro is harder for a fish to pick out. But 1.42 is not 1.33. That gap still bends light, still throws a faint edge. Fluorocarbon is less visible. It is not invisible. Anybody selling you invisible is selling you the space between those two numbers and hoping you never look it up. So here is how to actually use it, and where your money goes furthest. You do not need to fill an entire reel with fluorocarbon. You need a leader. Tie an arm's length of this vanish onto the end of your braid with a double uni knot, and now the last few feet closest to the bait, the only part a fish ever really studies, is the low visibility stuff, while the rest of your reel stays cheap, strong braid. One $9 spool ties you leaders for a whole season, and the real reasons fluoro earns its spot are not magic at all. It sinks, which pins your bait down. It is dense, so it shrugs off abrasion better than mono, and it is stiff, which telegraphs a light bite up the line. Those are the honest advantages. The invisibility was always just the part they put on the front of the box. Number 6. The braid hiding a performance fiber most guys have never heard of. Suffix 832, around $12 to $14. The name is not random. 8 strands, 32 weaves per inch. But here is the part worth knowing. 7 of those 8 strands are the usual gel-spun fiber, the same slick, strong material they make body armor and sailing rope out of. The 8th strand is a Gore performance fiber, cousin to the stuff in high-end rain gear, and it is there to help the line hold its round shape and shed water. Why do you care about strand count at all? A braid woven from more, thinner strands comes out rounder and smoother. Rounder and smoother means it casts farther, digs into the spool less, and throws fewer wind knots. A cheap 4-strand braid comes out flatter and rougher. That is fine for dragging fish out of heavy cover, but rough on your casting. So when you are standing at the wall, flip the box over and read the carrier count. 8 carrier for casting and smoothness, 4 carrier for raw grit in the slop. That is a real spec that changes how the line fishes, sitting right there in the small print, while the front of the box just yells a big number at you. Quick breath at the halfway mark. If reading the wall this way is already saving you money, subscribing is the only thing that keeps this channel going, because there is no sponsor behind any of it. Just the honest number on gear. Now, the top 5. Number 5. The braid that lets you feel a fish breathe on your bait, and the spool I will use to give you the second big free trick. Spider Wire Stealth, around $13. This is real gel-spun braid with a slick coating, thin and low stretch, and it carries a name that gets a nod at the boat ramp. But the reason it is here is the lesson it teaches, and it is the one thing I would write on the inside lid of every tackle box. Stop trusting the pound test number and start reading the diameter. In the United States, the pound test stamped on a spool is barely regulated. 2 braids, both labeled 30-pound, can be completely different thicknesses, and a mono-stamped 10-pound might actually hold to 15 before it lets go. The number on the front is closer to a suggestion than a promise. Diameter, the little millimeter measurement in the fine print, is the honest spec. A thinner line at the same real strength casts farther, sinks faster, gets bitten more, and lets you cram more yards onto the reel. So when 2 spools claim the same pound test, buy the one with the smaller diameter. That is a free upgrade hiding in the part of the box nobody reads. One fair warning on spider wire, so I am telling you the whole truth. It fades color faster than some, and after a hard day the last few feet can look a little fuzzy. That part is cosmetic. It has never cost me a fish. Retie your knot anyway. Number 4. The value braid that exposes the whole game, and the spool that halves your braid bill if you let it. Cast King Superpower, around $12 to $15, woven from the same gel-spun fiber family as the $30 name-brand braid sitting one shelf over. Serious anglers who have fished both will tell you the same quiet thing. On the water, they cannot feel the difference. The premium braid has a slightly slicker coating and holds its color a touch longer. Those are real things. Neither one puts a single extra fish in the boat. Now the trick, and this is a good one. Braid is slick, so on a bare reel it slips. The whole spool spins under a hard hook set, and your line just rotates in place. And you never cast down to the very bottom of your line anyway. So do not fill the reel with braid. Lay down a base of cheap mono first, Trilene XL, or the house spool I am about to crown, until the reel is about 2/3 full. Then join your braid on top with a double uni knot and fill the rest. The mono grips the spool so nothing slips, and you just cut your braid cost roughly in half by only buying the top 100 yards you actually use. One more spooling note while we are here. Stop filling about 1/8 of an inch from the spool lip. Overfill it, and the coils spring off in a bird's nest on your first cast. Underfill it, and you quietly lose casting distance on every throw. Number 3. The 4th kind of line I promised you. The one that is not braid and is not mono, and does not get its own section on most store walls because it confuses the layout. Berkley FireLine. This is a fused superline. Instead of weaving the gel-spun strands into a braid, Berkley thermally fuses 8 of them into a single line. Berkley put the first version out back in 1996 and basically invented the whole category. So what does fusing get you that braid does not? It comes out stiffer and far more abrasion resistant. Berkley's own testing claims several times the abrasion resistance of a comparable braid, and that is the manufacturer's number, so take it as their claim rather than gospel, but the toughness shows up on the water. That stiffness is a gift on a spinning reel. The line stays put and stops throwing those infuriating wind knots that slick braid loves to blow up into. There is even a translucent version called FireLine Crystal that fishes far more low-vis than the standard smoke color. Now the honest downside, because there is always one. That same stiffness means more memory and more coil than limp braid, and it is more visible than fluoro. So it is not a leader material, and it is not what you want in glass-clear finesse water. But for a tough, sensitive main line on a spinning reel in stained water, panfish, walleye, crappie, general search fishing, it is a quiet weapon that most people walk right past, purely because it does not fit into the three kinds of line they were taught to look for. Number 2. The strength per dollar king, and the spool that teaches you cost per yard math better than any spreadsheet ever could. Berkley FireLine Big Game. The quarter-pound spool runs around $12 and holds a wall of line. A 25-pound spool carries somewhere around 600 yards, and the bulk sizes climb into the thousands. This is the catfish, surf, and big water line. Raw, tough, abrasion-resistant nylon that shrugs off rocks, oyster beds, and dock pilings. Here is the math that should change how you shop. That one $12 spool can fill a big reel 3 or 4 times over. The exact same amount of line, bought in cute little retail spools at the premium counter, would run you $50, $60. This is the line a lot of charter guides quietly keep by the case, in a milk crate on the deck, not because it is fancy, but because it flat out works, and it costs almost nothing to keep every reel topped off. When you learn to divide the price by the yards, instead of staring at the pound test, the whole wall reorganizes itself in front of you. And that value you were sold at the premium counter starts to look like the worst deal in the store. And number 1, the absolute gold mine, the spool with no famous name at all that most guys have never once picked up because it is the store's own house brand and it does not have a single dollar of advertising behind it. Ozark Trail HD monofilament, Walmart's own line. Look at what it actually is. It is nylon, the same base material every other mono on that wall is made from. And the spool sizes are almost comical. The 6-pound test holds nearly 2,400 yards for under $7. 2,400 yards. You could re-spool every reel you own, twice over, for the price of one premium spool that runs dry after a single fill. It is low memory, shock-resistant, rated for fresh and salt. For panfish, trout, everyday bobber fishing, the kids' rods, and as the mono backing under all your braid, it simply works. This one spool is the whole thesis of that wall standing in your hand. It is not the strongest line in the store, and I am not telling you it is tournament grade. What it is the lowest cost per yard on the wall, doing the honest work of line, with zero markup and zero logo. And that is exactly why you have never noticed it. There is no ad budget for the spool that just quietly does the job, so your eye never lands on it. The fish, meanwhile, have never once graded your line by its price. They never have, and they never will. So if it were my money, here is how I would spool the whole boat for less than one trip to the premium counter. Ozark Trail HD on the panfish rods, the kids' rods, and as backing under everything. Trilene XL for the smooth all-around casting setups, and XT anywhere I am fishing hardcover. Stren where I want stretch on treble baits. Big Game on the catfish and surf rods. FireLine on a spinning reel in stained water. Spider wire, or Cast King braid on the base setups, with a vanish leader tied on for clear water. Every reel full, one premium spool's worth of money. Now a few last things the box will never tell you, because they keep line on your reel longer, and line that lasts is line you do not have to rebuy. First, wet every knot before you cinch it down. A dry knot heats up as it tightens, and that heat burns and weakens the line. Most break-offs do not happen out on the fish. They happen at the knot you tied dry. A little spit or water, every time. Second, learn the stretch test for deadline. Pull off a foot of old mono and stretch it between your hands. Fresh mono stretches maybe 15 to 30% and springs right back. If it snaps with almost no stretch, or it comes off the reel in stiff coils that will not lay flat, it is done. Retire it before it costs you the next good fish. Third, know that your line has a clock ticking on it. Nylon mono breaks down from ultraviolet light and water, whether you fish it or not. Most anglers should replace their mono every year or two, and a spool baking on the back deck or locked in a hot truck dies a lot faster than one stored in a cool, dark drawer. Braid lasts longer because the fiber resists ultraviolet, but its coating still wears. So keep your spare spools out of the sun, and change your line before the season starts, not after it snaps on the fish of the year. Line is cheap. That fish is not. And one thing that is not about catching more fish, but matters just as much. When you strip off that old line, do not let it blow into the water or the weeds. Monofilament can sit in a lake for hundreds of years, and it wraps around birds, turtles, and boat propellers. Wind it into a ball and drop it in a monofilament recycling bin. A lot of boat ramps and tackle shops keep them now. Run through the Boat US Foundation's Reel In and Recycle program, and the collected line gets melted down into new plastic at the Berkley Conservation Institute up in Spirit Lake, Iowa. One catch. Those bins take mono and fluorocarbon, not braid, so cut your old braid short and bag it in the trash instead. And whatever you are chasing, and however you decide to rig it, check your state and local regulations before you fish, because line rules, disposal rules, and what is legal on your water change from one state to the next. Here is where some of you are going to argue with me, and I want you to. I think for 90% of freshwater fishing, the color of your line and the logo on the box matter less than the direction you spooled it and the day you last changed it. Tell me I am wrong. Drop a comment with the cheapest spool you have ever landed a real fish on and what it cost you, because real numbers from real anglers beat every marketing claim ever printed on a box. If reading the wall this way saved you money, the full breakdown, every line, every job, the spooling diagrams, the cost per yard tables, and a respool schedule sorted by line type is in the free blueprint linked below. No sponsor, no brand worship, just the honest number on gear. I will see you on the water.